It started on a rainy Tuesday in March. News came in waves, first as rumors, then as silence, and finally as panic. The skies lit up with burning trails, alien ships descending through the atmosphere, not to attack, not to trade, but to unload. They called it a galactic correction. That's what the transmission said. Cold, formal, almost smug. Some alien council, far beyond human reach, had decided Earth was too emotionally reactive, too naive in its defense of self-determination in the outer colonies. Our refusal to support their oppression, to stay quiet while planets were stripped and voices crushed, that made us soft, they claimed. So, to teach us a lesson, they dumped 6 million displaced beings onto our surface, from a dozen different planets, victims of wars we didn't start, beings with nowhere to go. Some with scars deeper than we could understand. They weren't monsters, just desperate, broken people. And we were told, now you deal with them. The first ship came down near the Rockies. Massive, quiet, not a single weapon on it. When it opened, there was no army, no chaos, just rows of the displaced. Tall, skeletal species with skin like cracked stone. Small, insectoid ones with twitchy limbs and terrified eyes. Mothers clutching children. Old ones that could barely move. The world panicked. Of course it did. Governments shouted over each other. Some said to close borders, treat the arrival as an invasion. Others screamed for help from the same council that had punished us. But help never came. And somehow, amid all that noise, it was the everyday people who stepped forward. In Denver, a high school principal opened his school as a shelter. In Lagos, a retired nurse began organizing health checks for the insectoid children. In Mumbai, a young woman used a drone network to deliver food drops. They didn't wait for permission. They saw the pain and acted. I remember the first time I met one of them. His name wasn't something I could pronounce, but it sounded like humming glass. He stood taller than any human I'd ever seen, with skin like cooled lava and eyes that shimmered like oil on water. He didn't speak at first, just stared silently as I offered him water. He took it in both hands like it was sacred, drank slow, careful. Then he said, in near-perfect English, "You're not afraid of me?" I shook my head, though truthfully, I was. A little. But more than that, I was curious. He told me his story. His planet had been torn apart for its resources. His family, gone. Not to war, but to bureaucracy. Processed, lost, forgotten. He didn't cry, his species didn't. But he told it like someone who'd carried it too long. That was when I knew. This wasn't just an alien problem. This was a human one now, whether we liked it or not. Not everyone felt the same. In some cities, there were protests, then riots, then attacks. A bombing in Berlin killed 23. 14 were refugees. Conspiracy theories flooded the net, that it was a covert invasion, that they were spies, that they were diseased. It spread like wildfire. But the strange thing was, even as that ugliness tried to spread, it was always drowned out by something bigger. Kindness. In Buenos Aires, thousands gathered to build shelters. In Seoul, volunteers taught language classes to refugees who wanted to work. In New York, people stood in lines for hours just to donate shoes. Not all of Earth answered with fear. Much of it answered with heart. I think that's what made them panic. The council, I mean. They expected chaos, breakdown, that we'd turn on each other, that our compassion would eat us alive. Instead, it made us stronger. Earth became something they hadn't prepared for. A symbol and a threat. We didn't have a blueprint, no guidebook, no galactic manual on how to absorb 6 million souls from 17 different species into one struggling, fragile planet. Everything we did, we had to figure out in real time, often by trial, error, and raw instinct. And we made mistakes, plenty of them. There were fights over land, over language, over culture. There were misunderstandings that turned deadly. A group of desert dwellers from a water-poor world almost died when their camp was built next to a polluted river in southern Africa. They didn't understand filtration or warning signs. We didn't understand their biology. It cost lives. And then there were the purists, human extremists who believed Earth was for humans, full stop. They started wearing uniforms, carrying weapons, claiming to be protectors of the pure species, as if we hadn't learned anything from our own bloody history. But even in that chaos, something strange was happening. Slowly, quietly, people were adapting. I remember walking through one of the early integration zones, set up in old shipping yards outside Lisbon. Rows of retrofitted containers turned into homes. Some were warm, with handmade curtains and cooking fires. Others were quiet, almost empty, occupied by refugees who hadn't spoken since they arrived. In one corner, a woman named Adira, an earthborn linguist who used to teach at a university, sat cross-legged with a group of young refugees whose skin glowed faintly in the dark. They called themselves the Feratai. They communicated using a mix of low-frequency vibration and color changes in their skin. Adira had built a simple device, a box with sensors that converted their vibrations into a crude voice. It wasn't perfect, but it allowed for the first real conversations between our species. The children were the first to laugh. Kids don't care about borders or politics or skin tone, human or otherwise. They just want to play. And once they started, everything else followed. Parents talked, shared food. Stories, losses. In one day, over soup and bad translations, they became neighbors. That was the kind of quiet revolution happening all over the world. Not on government stages, not on the news, but in backyards, shelters, classrooms. And I'll tell you something that always stuck with me. For every loudmouth saying we were being overrun, 10 more were quietly offering blankets or jobs or space in their garage. But the problem was bigger than charity. 6 million refugees meant 6 million beings who needed food, shelter, medicine, education, and a future. Earth was already stretched thin. Climate zones were unstable, economies were fragile. We'd only just begun reversing the damage from our own industrial centuries. And now we were being tested to our limits. So humanity did what it always does when pushed too far. We innovated. In Nairobi, a group of engineers turned abandoned skyscrapers into vertical farms that could feed 20,000 people with almost no water waste. In Calgary, exobiologists developed nutrient packs based on the digestion needs of over a dozen alien species using only plant-based earth materials. In Shanghai, they reprogrammed obsolete shipping drones to deliver aid to hard-hit refugee zones. This wasn't government-led. This was street-level brilliance. It made the council nervous. We weren't supposed to survive this. We were supposed to collapse, or turn violent, or beg for help. That was their gamble when they dumped those ships on us. They wanted us broken, humiliated. Instead, we were rising, but not without scars. I visited one of the worst hit zones just outside what used to be Istanbul. A camp that had turned into a city overnight. Over 300,000 souls, half of them from a species known as the Anzalari. They were photosynthetic, plant-based life forms who needed specific light frequencies to survive. Earth's sun was barely enough. Without supplemental light, they began to wither. The black market saw an opportunity. Shady vendors sold artificial UV bulbs at 10 times the cost, some of them faulty, some of them lethal. People were dying in the dark, paying to be burned alive, just for the chance to keep breathing. I met a man there. His name sounded like wind through reeds. but he let me call him Solon. He'd been a poet on his homeworld, lost his entire grove during the planetary evacuation. His people didn't have traditional families. Each grove was one collective being, bonded spiritually and chemically. Losing them was like amputating your soul. He still spoke with gentle grace, even while dying of light deprivation. "I do not blame you," he said to me. "This planet is kind, tired, but kind." That broke me a little, because even in his last days, he saw our kindness before he saw our failures. We lost Solon the next morning. The camp held a vigil. Hundreds stood in silence as his remains were buried beneath a sun lamp donated by a group of Brazilian students who'd crowdfunded it without telling anyone. His grave wasn't just a grave. It became a garden, a shrine, a promise. Earth was becoming something new, something not entirely human anymore. And it wasn't long before the council noticed. It began with small incidents. Council supply ships mysteriously delayed. Interstellar communications slowed. Diplomatic envoys ignored. Trade agreements quietly canceled. It was pressure, subtle, legal, polished. They couldn't be seen punishing us again outright, not when half the galaxy was watching. So they used bureaucracy, starved us slowly, made us sweat. But here's the thing about Earth. We were built in struggle, born in war, forged in famine, revolution, and protest. We know how to resist. One by one, planets in the outer colonies began to watch our progress. Some reached out in secret. Others sent observers. And then something unexpected happened. One of the refugee ships, held in orbit because of limited landing clearance, suddenly went rogue. Not towards Earth. Towards the Council's nearest outpost. At first, everyone panicked. Thought it was retaliation. Thought Earth was behind it. But when the ship broadcast its message, the entire galaxy froze. "We were discarded," the voice said. "Not because Earth failed us, but because Earth gave us hope." The ship wasn't attacking. It was defecting. With hundreds of refugees aboard, it docked with the outpost and requested asylum. Not on Earth, but in Earth's name. They wanted to be Earth citizens. Can you imagine that? Aliens, refugees, victims of empire, choosing to wear the name of the planet that took them in, not because we were powerful, but because we were kind. It shattered the illusion. Suddenly, Earth wasn't the problem anymore. The Council was. The narrative began to shift. The story they tried to write, of humans being overwhelmed, broken by our own compassion, was falling apart in real time. And they started to get desperate. 1 week after the defection, 3 refugee camps were bombed simultaneously, not by locals. Not by governments, but by high-tech orbital drones with no known Earth signature. They didn't even bother hiding it. Over 600 died. More than half of them children. The Council didn't claim responsibility. They didn't have to. Their silence said everything. That's when the real question landed on humanity's shoulders. We had shown compassion. We had held the line. But now we had to decide if we would fight, not just for ourselves, but for the millions they silenced, displaced, and buried, and for the future we were building. Together. The decision didn't come easy. Earth held its first truly global assembly in decades. Representatives from every continent. Refugee leaders, scientists, teachers, former soldiers. Voices from every language, every background. The debate lasted for 6 days. But in the end, we agreed on one thing. We weren't victims. We were a beacon, and that meant we couldn't afford to hide. The declaration was short, just a single paragraph, but it shook the stars. To those who seek shelter, Earth is home. To those who profit from pain, Earth will resist. We will not beg. We will not bow. We will build something better, together. From that moment on, we weren't just a planet. We were a movement. It was strange how fast the world changed after that declaration. In the past, Earth only ever spoke in fragments. Governments spoke for nations, corporations spoke for profits, and politicians spoke mostly to hear themselves. But now, for the first time in centuries, we had a unified voice. A messy, imperfect voice, yes, but one forged in fire and compassion. And people listened. It started on the outer colonies, small planets. Mining towns, agricultural hubs, places that had long suffered under the thumb of the Galactic Council, their people treated more like data than living beings. These colonies had been watching Earth closely. Most didn't trust us, not fully, but they saw something new growing here, something raw and honest. When Earth sent out that declaration, simple, defiant, and inclusive, it struck a chord that hadn't been heard in generations. On the planet Galore 6, a resistance group that had been hiding for a decade broadcast Earth's message into the heart of their capital. On Niveron, a planet whose population was nearly enslaved under council labor codes, workers walked off the job in silent protest. And somewhere in the asteroid belt near Vega, a rogue broadcasting satellite reactivated and started repeating Earth's signal on loop. We will build something better, together. But it wasn't just words that shook the stars. It was action. We started mobilizing. Not with warships. We didn't have many. Not with armies. We didn't believe in conquest. But with alliances. With technology. With hope. The 6 million refugees who had been dumped on us? They weren't victims anymore. They were builders, scientists, engineers, healers, warriors. Their skills were diverse, and their anger had found a purpose, not for revenge, but for justice. One of the first joint missions launched from Earth's orbit wasn't a weapon. It was a medical fleet. 6 ships, built using human engineering and alien biotech, staffed by multi-species crews. Their goal, to travel to abandoned war zones across the stars and deliver care. They called themselves the Mendicant Fleet, and they went where the Council had caused the most harm. They treated radiation sickness on the moons of Delaris. They rebuilt lungs for miners on Verone 3 who had been breathing toxic dust for decades. They taught local doctors how to create sustainable medicine from native plants and alien biochemistry. Everywhere they went, they flew a single flag, a blue circle wrapped around a green flame. Earth's new symbol. It wasn't about territory anymore. It was about trust. Back home, not everyone was on board. There were still pockets of resistance, those who believed we were giving too much, too fast, that we were risking everything for people who weren't ours. There were attacks, sabotage, disinformation campaigns. In one heartbreaking case, a refugee shelter in Alaska was burned to the ground by local purists. No one died, but every family lost the only place they had felt safe in months. The response from the community was immediate. Hundreds of people from the nearby towns arrived the next day with food, clothes, tools. Volunteers rebuilt the shelter in under a week. The local church donated its land to make sure the new shelter was bigger and warmer. A teenager who helped carry the beams said something that would later go viral. If aliens can survive genocide and still trust us with their lives, the least we can do is hold the damn door open. It wasn't perfect, but it was powerful. Earth had been forced to become more than a planet. We were becoming a sanctuary, and sanctuaries need guardians. So we built them. The first of the Unity Guard were trained in the Himalayas, at a repurposed base that used to be a weather station. The Guard wasn't an army. They were peacekeepers, engineers, translators, protectors. Each unit was made up of a mix, humans and refugees side by side. They trained in zero-gravity, harsh weather, biohazard scenarios. They learned 20 languages between them, including nonverbal and telepathic communication. I met one of them. Her name was Lyra. She'd grown up in rural Kenya, lost her brother in the first refugee riots, and signed up not out of vengeance, but to protect people like him. Her partner, a tall, spindly being from a swamp world called Jireen, had once been a field surgeon in a war zone. Together, they ran security for refugee schools in contested zones. Lyra told me something I've never forgotten. "We're not protecting Earth from aliens," she said. "We're protecting the future from fear." But as Earth grew more united, the Council grew more desperate. That's when they sent their message. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was worse. They called it the Reckoning Directive. A cold, legal document, dozens of pages long, laced with diplomatic venom. It said Earth had violated multiple interstellar trade agreements by harboring political fugitives, that by assisting enemies of the galactic order, we were in breach of galactic law, that unless we surrendered specific individuals, including refugee leaders and Earth diplomats, we would face planetary quarantine. Quarantine. It sounded like science, clinical, logical. But we knew what it meant. Isolation, blockade, starvation, death by red tape. We had 2 weeks to comply. Our world held its breath. In the past, that kind of threat would have broken us. 2 decades ago, Earth was fractured, distracted by profits, tangled in bureaucracy, afraid to rock the boat. But that Earth was gone. Now our leaders held a press conference, not behind podiums or in marble halls, but standing together on the rooftop of a refugee hospital in Senegal. The statement was clear. "We will not give you our friends." Simple as that. Within hours, Earth's global network lit up. People from every region sent messages of support, videos, artwork, songs. Kids made posters. Refugees translated Earth literature into their own languages and shared it across the stars. We were done being silent. The Council responded with force. On the 14th day, a blockade formed above our orbit. 30 Council ships, sleek, silver, lined with weapons. They didn't fire, not yet, but they cut off our off-world comms, our trade lanes, our satellite feeds. We were alone. Or so we thought. The first message came from beyond the system, from a planet called Ithiska Prime. A beacon signal, repeating one phrase, "Earth stands, so do we." Then another, then another. Dozens of colony worlds began to break silence. Ships launched, supplies delivered through back channels, refugee smugglers turned into lifelines. Pirate fleets, once enemies of peace, joined Earth's cause, not for profit, but because, as one said, if Earth burns, the whole damn dream burns with it. Then something happened no one expected. One of the Council's ships defected. Not a refugee vessel, not a pirate, a real Council-certified warship. The captain, a decorated soldier from a race known for their cold logic, sent a single transmission. I was told Earth was weak, but I see now they are just good, and I would rather die for goodness than live for cruelty. He turned his ship around and positioned it between Earth and the blockade. Within hours, 2 more followed, and then 5 more. By the end of the week, Earth had more ships protecting it than threatening it. The Council didn't retreat. Not yet. But they paused. And in that pause, we grew stronger. Back on Earth, life didn't stop. The refugee cities expanded. Mixed neighborhoods formed, blending architecture, cuisine, music. Interspecies schools became normal. You'd hear alien lullabies in human daycares. Humans learning to write with 4 fingers instead of 5. Markets that sold food you couldn't pronounce, but somehow loved anyway. We were changing. And for the first time in galactic history, change didn't mean collapse. It meant rebirth. We had taken 6 million broken lives, and in turn they helped fix us. And that terrified the ones in power. Because Earth had done the impossible. We had turned punishment into unity, cruelty into community, and fear into a force for hope. You could feel it in the air. Even though the Council ships still hovered in Earth's orbit like silent vultures, something had shifted. They weren't the center of fear anymore. We were no longer looking up in terror. We were looking forward, planning, building. And it wasn't just us. By now, over 30 planetary colonies across different systems had sent encrypted messages to Earth's resistance network. Some asked for advice, some asked for protection. A few were bold enough to send volunteers, refugees who had found safety on Earth now returning to their own worlds, not as victims, but as ambassadors of something new. But with that growth came pressure. Earth's leaders, what we now called the Terran Unity Council, had to hold together a wildly diverse world. And not just humans anymore. There were 17 known alien species living among us, each with their own customs, needs, histories. Some tensions simmered. There was a near disaster in the Amazon region when a group of aquatic refugees tried to redirect a freshwater river into a nutrient tank for their young. Local farmers panicked, thinking it was a takeover. One man even fired a gun into the air. But nobody died that day. Because by then, each refugee settlement had what were called harmony units, mixed teams of humans and refugees trained in conflict de-escalation. They didn't come in with guns. They came in with understanding. By sundown, both sides were sitting under trees, trading fish and fruit, watching the kids play together. It wasn't easy, but it worked. That became the new standard. Not perfection, but effort. We learned things fast, like how certain ferriti children whose skin could absorb ultraviolet light were being overexposed in certain parts of Australia. Schools started building special shaded domes. Teachers learned ferriti color shift sign language. In return, some of the ferriti helped humans improve their solar panel tech, doubling efficiency with a single adjustment. Give and take. That's what it became. Back at the orbital blockade, tensions were boiling. The Council had started issuing direct threats. Not flashy, not cinematic, just quiet shutdowns. They began freezing accounts, blocking food shipments to allied worlds, targeting human-built infrastructure in remote colonies. In one tragic case, a refugee-run hospital on Gliesa 47 was bombed by Council proxies. They claimed it was a smuggling hub. But every soul there had a name, a story. 2 of them had been trained nurses from Manila. One was a former street medic from New York. All dead. That changed everything. The Terran Unity Council met in emergency session. This time, they weren't alone. Broadcast live in over 80 languages, including pheromone-based and vibrational formats, leaders from across refugee groups stood beside Earth's representatives, shoulder to shoulder. No suits, no robes, just worn clothes. Tired eyes and quiet determination. The message was clear. We didn't start this, but we will finish it, together. For the first time, Earth officially declared the formation of an interspecies alliance, headquartered in Nairobi, with outposts on Mars, Luna, and the orbital station Maya's Light, named after a little girl who had died in one of the first refugee bombings. But here's what made the alliance different. Every species got a seat at the table. Every decision had to be voted on by consensus, not majority rule. That meant slower decisions, sure, more debates, but it also meant nobody was left out. And in a galaxy ruled by efficiency and domination, that model was revolutionary. We didn't call it a government. We called it a home in progress. The next wave of trouble came from within. There were whispers of betrayal. High-ranking Earth officials being bribed by the Council, data leaks. Someone had tried to sabotage the Alliance's communication grid from the inside. They traced it to a former Earth diplomat, someone who had once argued against taking the refugees in the first place. He'd been feeding the Council information for months, hoping Earth would fall so he could rise in their ranks. When they caught him, they didn't imprison him. They brought him before the council, not to punish, to ask why. He broke down, said he wasn't evil, just afraid. Afraid that Earth couldn't survive this path. That compassion was weakness, that he had tried to protect the planet by giving the council what it wanted. He looked around the room as if expecting a firing squad. Instead, one of the refugee elders stepped forward. A woman with silver skin and eyes like molten gold. She placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You were afraid, so were we, but we chose courage anyway, that's the difference." And they let him go. He didn't run, he stayed, helped rebuild the grid he tried to sabotage. That moment was broadcast across half the galaxy. People saw that mercy didn't mean naivety. It meant strength. The council was losing control of the narrative, and they knew it. That's when they stopped pretending. The attack didn't come with warning. No red alerts, no countdown. Just silence. Then fire. 2 ships broke formation and launched kinetic strikes at Maya's Light, the orbital station housing over 4,000 civilians. The station didn't have heavy weapons, just rescue pods and hope. The impact tore through the eastern wing, killing over 100. But something happened that no one, not even the council, could have predicted. The refugees fought back, not with missiles, not with fleets, with their bodies. 4 Faratai engineers, trained in zero-G environments, manually stabilized the oxygen systems by holding open the emergency seals with their own limbs. They suffocated before help could reach them. 2 Anzalari healers, whose biology allowed them to withstand radiation, crawled through leaking reactor chambers to trigger emergency cooling. They didn't survive either. But the station? It held. And in the days that followed, it became a symbol again. This time, not just of survival, but of sacrifice. Across Earth, memorials were built. Not statues, not monuments, gardens, living things, just like those who had been lost. People didn't cry for aliens anymore. They cried for friends. That grief turned into something sharper. The Terran Unity Council, now backed by nearly 50 worlds, issued its final message to the Galactic Council. It wasn't diplomatic. It wasn't poetic. It was simply this: you cannot scare what has already survived hell. We will not kneel. Earth wasn't looking to rule. But we weren't looking to beg either. So the Interspecies Alliance launched its first official mission, Project Haven, a multi-planet initiative to create protected zones for any being fleeing Council oppression. Safe corridors, supply routes, mobile sanctuaries, Earth tech mixed with alien resilience. They even converted one of the old refugee ships into a traveling embassy, half hospital, half school, fully armed with the best defense systems we had. And etched on the hull, in over 100 languages, were the words that started this all. We chose compassion, not cruelty. That's when the tide truly began to turn. Council worlds started revolting. Trade hubs refused to enforce sanctions. Some council soldiers began leaking internal documents, exposing centuries of exploitation and cover-ups. And slowly, painfully, the council's grip began to slip. Back on Earth, things were still hard. Not every city was perfect. Not every neighbor got along. There were still protests, still setbacks, still reminders that progress doesn't come clean. But there was music again, and laughter, and food that mixed spices from 3 planets, and neighborhoods where kids spoke 4 languages before the age of 10. We had been punished for our compassion, but instead of breaking us, it remade us, and in doing so, it gave the galaxy something it hadn't had in centuries: hope. By the time Earth's Project Haven launched its 3rd mobile sanctuary, the Council's silence had turned bitter. They weren't speaking through declarations anymore. They'd stopped sending ambassadors, stopped issuing sanctions, stopped pretending they were in control of the story. Now they were speaking only through violence. It started as whispers, unexplained disappearances, refugees en route to Earth who never arrived, ships gone dark in safe zones, entire planetary communication networks blacked out for maintenance. No one wanted to believe it at first. But soon, the truth came through. They had started targeting refugee routes, not with fleets, with precision, silent, selective elimination. No witnesses, no broadcasts, just disappearances. Ghost attacks. The galaxy began calling them clean sweeps. One of the first survivors, barely clinging to life after drifting in an escape pod for 5 days, was a boy no older than 9. He wasn't human. Something close, though. He had sand-colored skin that shimmered faintly in the light, and his eyes looked far too tired for someone his age. He didn't speak when we found him, just stared at the stars through the glass window, mumbling the same 3 words over and over. "Where's my sky?" He wasn't the only one. By the end of the month, 32 known transports were missing. 16 colonies had gone silent. The message was obvious. The Council couldn't crush Earth's spirit, but they could make kindness expensive. If we kept helping, we'd keep losing. But what they didn't count on, what they never understood, was that Earth had already made peace with loss. We'd lived through world wars, famine, genocide, climate collapse. We knew grief, but more importantly, we knew how to carry it. So we carried it forward. We started arming the sanctuaries, not with weapons meant to destroy, but shields, cloaking fields, displacement tech borrowed from alien allies who once had to use it to hide entire cities. Every mobile embassy was now equipped to disappear into the void if needed. We turned refugee routes into moving puzzles. No fixed paths, no predictability. Convoys were randomized. Decoy signals blasted across frequencies. Even Earth's orbital station, Maya's Light, had a new twin, cloaked in lunar shadow, built in secret by human and refugee engineers working in silence. But we couldn't just hide forever. So we built Horizon Watch. It wasn't a weapon. It was a listening array, one that could track Council fleet activity across a dozen systems using signals buried beneath radiation storms, solar interference, even black hole echoes. It was alien tech at its core, fused with Earth's AI and intuition. It was beautiful, sprawling fields of mirrored spires positioned in the deserts of northern Chile, shimmering like glass mountains under starlight. We called it the Ear of Earth, and with it we saw what came next. A fleet. Larger than anything the Council had deployed in centuries, not headed for Earth, but for Vera 9, a small moon where over 100,000 refugees had built a fragile new home under Earth's protection. We didn't have enough time to evacuate, but we had something better. We had them. The refugees. They weren't just survivors anymore. Over the last few years they had trained, learned, built. They knew the land better than any invading force. And for once, they were not running. They were standing. Earth sent what we could. Peacekeepers, medics, engineers, a few outdated defense ships. But when the Council's fleet arrived, what they found wasn't a target. It was a fortress made of desperation, love, and stubbornness. They expected compliance. They found resistance. The siege of Vera 9 lasted 12 days. It wasn't clean. It wasn't cinematic. It was chaos. Skirmishes in the dirt, handheld shield generators, gravity grenades, improvised drones. At one point, a field of mirrored plants, genetically modified by a refugee botanist, was detonated, blinding an entire Council battalion long enough for civilians to escape. I watched the footage later. Silent, shaky body cam video from a refugee teenager who'd volunteered as a runner between medical tents. In the middle of an airstrike, She turned her camera toward the sky, her face covered in ash, and whispered, "You said we could stay, so we're staying." That clip was replayed 1,000,000 times across the stars, and when the council finally withdrew, they didn't take the moon. They didn't even scratch its surface. Instead, they left behind the one thing they never meant to create: a legend. Vera 9 became a rallying cry. Refugees on distant worlds painted its symbol, 3 streaks of blue over a silver moon, on walls, ships, clothes. Children knew the names of its defenders the way we used to know pop stars and sports heroes. Even Earth schools began teaching about the siege, not as a war story, but as a lesson in what unity truly costs. The Council had tried to bury the spark. Instead, they'd lit a wildfire. The interspecies alliance swelled. Planets that once sat on the sidelines began joining, not in hatred, not in vengeance, but because they saw what Earth had done. We hadn't just offered shelter. We'd offered dignity. Back on Earth, we were still struggling. Cities had changed. Infrastructure stretched thin. Not every neighborhood was ready, not every heart open. But the line had shifted. Even the doubters, the ones who once feared the alien problem, couldn't ignore the reality anymore. These people weren't guests. They were family. You'd see it in little things. A human grandparent learning how to cook with ferriti spices because their granddaughter had married one. Refugee poets performing in cafes beside punk bands. Construction crews mixing concrete with chitin and sand because a refugee engineer discovered it made earthquake-proof housing. In one quiet neighborhood in New Delhi, a street mural showed human children holding hands with alien ones, dancing under a tree with branches from 3 planets. Below it, the words, "We learned to grow sideways." And that's what we were doing. Not climbing, not conquering, growing sideways, spreading roots, intertwining. But the galaxy was still burning. There were still colonies under siege, still children in transit ships who didn't know what safety meant. And we knew, sooner or later, the Council would try again. That's when the whispers started. An idea. Not from the top, not from any government, but from the ground. People began saying, maybe Earth shouldn't just be a planet anymore. Maybe it should be a symbol, a movement, a place you carry with you, a place not defined by geography, but by values. So the idea was born, the Earthborn Accord. A pact, simple, clear. Any being, human or otherwise, who upheld the values of sanctuary, dignity, and compassion would be considered Earthborn, regardless of where they lived, what they looked like, or what system they called home. No visas, no borders, just belonging. The accord spread like wildfire. Refugee fleets painted Earthborn on their hulls. Colonies in other systems held Earthborn ceremonies. One pirate captain, once feared for raiding council convoys, broadcast a declaration that he would now only attack ships violating Earthborn refugee corridors. He ended the message with a salute, and the Earthborn motto, "We don't run from fire. We carry water." It wasn't official policy. It was louder than that. It was culture. The Council tried to outlaw it, but you can't outlaw an idea once it's taken root in the cracks of empire. We had become more than a planet. We had become a promise. And the Council? They were running out of time, because now it wasn't just Earth standing alone, it was Earthborn. And we were everywhere. It started with a whisper on the fringe worlds, barely a signal, easily missed. A small council base on the cold edge of the Yella system went dark. Then another on Sarun's belt. Then 4 more outposts scattered across the lesser rim. No explosion. No orbital debris. No cries for help. Just silence. It wasn't Earth. Wasn't the Alliance either. The ghost signals weren't ours. But they were carrying our name. Earthborn. That's all the hacked broadcasts said. flashed across empty comms, written in languages some of us didn't even recognize yet, overlaid on old council distress frequencies like graffiti on palace walls. We didn't know what it meant at first. Not fully. But we'd find out soon enough. The council was being dismantled from the inside, not by Earth, not by weapons, but by its own rot, and the people it had crushed for centuries. On Earth, we were still catching our breath from Vera 9, still rebuilding homes, healing bodies, planting gardens over graves. The Terran Unity Council had just signed agreements with 3 more colony worlds, former council planets who now called themselves sanctuary states. But something else was brewing in the background, a tension you could feel in the air. Not fear, not even grief. Something older. Rage. See, compassion had gotten us this far. It built bridges, saved lives, turned enemies into friends. But now? We were staring down a force that had no shame, no apology, no plans to stop. And the galaxy was watching to see if Earth would finally break and become what it was punished for resisting. Cruel. That was the Council's real trap. Make us care so much we lose ourselves. Force our hand. The Terran Unity Council debated it behind closed doors. The Alliance grew divided. Some argued that we had to strike now, that if we didn't, the next Vera 9 would be worse. Others held fast to the principle: no first strikes. We build, we don't destroy, one of them said. That's the Earthborn way. But the people outside those chambers? They were tired. Too many bodies. Too many names carved into metal plaques. That's when the Earthborn Accord began to fracture. Not from abandonment, but from evolution. You see, once an idea lives long enough, it grows teeth. A new group emerged, decentralized, quiet, ruthless in a way that made even Earth's peacekeepers uncomfortable. They called themselves Ashfall. Their message? Simple. We tried peace. Now we burn the chains. They didn't report to anyone. They didn't wear uniforms or fly official colors, but they operated under one banner. Earthborn vengeance. And they started hitting the Council where it hurt. Not civilians, not colonies, but vaults, prison worlds, research labs where species had been dissected in silence, economic servers that funded the slave routes they still denied using. Ashfall didn't leave warnings. They left evidence, broadcasts of what the Council hid, footage of tortured refugees. Audio logs of Council officers laughing about the disposables they dumped on Earth like garbage. Ashfall didn't ask for forgiveness. They didn't want applause. They wanted justice. And for some, that justice looked an awful lot like war. Earth tried to distance itself. Official statements poured out. We do not condone violence. We believe in due process. Ashfall is not sanctioned by the Terran Unity Council. But the truth? Earth knew exactly who some of them were, because some of them used to be us, former peacekeepers, medics who lost entire camps, parents who buried children after council bombings, even some refugees, those who had carried too much pain for too long, had crossed the line. And what do you do when your friends become revolutionaries? What do you do when the oppressed start fighting back on their own terms? Not yours? Earth was no longer just a place. It was an idea, and ideas can't be contained. Ashfall became legend. Council records called them terrorists. Earthborn broadcasts called them martyrs. Colonies whispered their names like prayers. In 1 year, they dismantled 17 council systems from within, without a single fleet. But there were consequences. For every council base that fell, 2 more planets saw their trade routes severed. The council responded with new tech, silence bombs that erased digital records, comms, even memories if dropped too close to populated zones. One sanctuary world, Tolvan, went completely dark after a silent strike. 500,000 people, gone from every signal map. That was the tipping point. Earth could no longer sit at the edge, hoping diplomacy would hold. The Terran Unity Council met in emergency session again, this time not on Earth, but on Maya's light, floating above the very planet that started it all. The debate was fierce. Some delegates demanded we call Ashfall what it was: dangerous, uncontrolled. Others said they were the consequence of our inaction. But the deciding voice came not from a human, but from a refugee leader named Reyna, an Anzalari elder who had survived 2 council purges and now led over a dozen settlements on Mars. She stepped forward, slowly, spine bent by years of grief, and spoke without notes. "Peace," she said, "is not the absence of pain. It is the promise we make to not pass it on." She paused, her golden eyes scanning the room. "And what promise do we keep when we bury our dead and let their killers eat in silence?" No one interrupted her. She kept going. "We cannot pretend anymore. The Council does not want our peace. It wants our surrender. And if Ashfall burns too bright, it is because we let the fire spread by standing still." In the silence that followed, Earth made its hardest decision. Not to go to war, but to step out of the shadow. From that day forward, Earth declared itself an active resistance state. No more neutrality, no more polite protests, but still no revenge. Our first act wasn't a fleet. It was a firewall. We used every satellite, every drone, every ship to build the Exodus net, a digital, interstellar lifeline that would guide any refugee, from any system, to safety. It could override council blockades, bounce off pulsars, embed coordinates in music. It was everywhere and nowhere. People started calling it the heartbeat of Earth. Even council citizens, those still trapped inside, found ways to reach it, whispered it into their radios, painted its symbols on the backs of credit chips. And Earth answered. Ships flew. Corridors opened. Refugees arrived not in desperation anymore, but in resistance. Ashfall kept operating. Earth kept building. And the Council? They were beginning to implode. More and more internal splits, uprisings on wealthy council worlds, defections from elite soldiers who'd seen too much. Even a few high-ranking diplomats began asking questions on open channels, begging for mercy, offering deals. But Earth was done making deals. You don't negotiate with people who throw children into fire. We didn't want control. We wanted freedom. And for the first time in galactic memory, freedom wasn't being handed down from emperors or councils. It was being built slowly, painfully, by the broken, the lost, and the angry. By the Earthborn. And now? Now the galaxy was waiting to see what came next. Because compassion got us here. But what would carry us forward? The answer wasn't a ship. It wasn't a weapon. It was a whisper. Quiet, steady, carried from one broken soul to another. We're still here. And that was enough. By the time the second solar ring was completed around Earth, we were no longer considered a backwater planet. No longer a punishment zone. No longer the soft, emotional little world that council elites once mocked in closed sessions and war room whispers. We had become a lighthouse. And lighthouses don't move. They stand tall in the storm. That storm was coming fast now. The council wasn't collapsing all at once, but the fractures were deep. Internal betrayals, economic failures, whole star systems peeling off like burned skin. Some of their own leaders fled to Earth, seeking asylum. One by one, the pillars they'd built their empire on, fear, dominance, isolation, began to crumble. But that made them dangerous. Empires don't die quiet. They rage, they lie, they claw at the air, dragging down anyone they can before their final breath. And Earth? We were now their greatest shame. Their mistake that wouldn't vanish. 6 million dumped lives had become 6 million sparks, and now the fire was in every system. But we weren't celebrating, because we hadn't won yet. Victory wasn't a speech, it was survival. And survival meant staying human, whatever that now meant. You could feel the tension in the capital of the Terran Unity Council. No longer just Nairobi, but all of Nairobi. Fused with refugee-built extensions, elevated gardens, winding biostructures from at least 9 different species. It had grown into a living organism of its own. They called it Umoja now. Unity. And in Umoja, everyone walked with purpose. Refugee engineers, Martian terraformers, Earthborn peacekeepers. Even kids had jobs. Small ones, like tending shared crops or recording oral histories from the elders. Every street corner had both grief and music. We'd lost so many. Vera Nime still had open memorials. Tolvin remained dark. Nothing had come back from the silence bombs. Entire families still waited, refusing to believe the worst. But we moved forward anyway, because hope didn't mean forgetting. It meant carrying. One of the most surprising things was how Earthborn culture started to form. Real culture, not just survival. Not just doing the right thing, but art, beliefs, celebrations. The Feratai and humans co-created a seasonal ritual called the Blooming, celebrating survival, where refugees painted one another with bioluminescent dye and told stories of people who were gone. Not sad stories, funny ones, beautiful ones. They said it helped grief grow flowers. One Earthborn poet, just 16, wrote a line that spread across 5 planets in a week. The council gave us ashes, we made soil. But as we bloomed, the shadow above us darkened. The council wasn't done. And this time, they weren't coming with quiet assassins or economic tricks. They were coming loud. The last great fleet of the council, 70 ships strong, 5 planetary siege-class carriers, war-tested and blood-soaked, gathered outside the Kiros expanse. That region was one hyperspace jump from Earth. They didn't even try to hide it. They wanted us to see, to feel the pressure, to crack. Some of our allies panicked. Smaller colonies begged us to back down, to beg for terms. Others promised troops, ships, anything. But they knew, and we knew, that if that fleet landed, no force on Earth could truly stop it. But maybe stopping it wasn't the goal. The Terran Unity Council didn't issue a battle order. They issued an invitation. It was absurd on paper, insane even. But real peace always sounds that way before it happens. They called for an emergency summit, on Earth, in Umoja, and not just for council members, for everyone, even the broken, even the angry, even the ones whose hands weren't clean, every known species, every rebel world. Every exiled diplomat was invited to come and witness what Earth had become, and decide if the old ways were still worth protecting. Some called it arrogant, some called it suicidal. But Earth wasn't asking. We were offering. That's the difference. And they came. Not all, not most, but enough. 4 council delegates, 2 Ashfall operatives, faces hidden, voices low. 5 resistance leaders from Vera 9. A child from a colony bombed in silence, carrying a recording cube with every story their people had left. They all came. Not to trust. Not to sing. But to listen. The summit lasted 3 days. Not in skyscrapers or marble halls, but in an open-air circle, under solar vines and ancestral trees, with the city humming in the distance, and refugee children playing within earshot. The council delegates expected lectures. Instead, they got questions. Why do you need control so badly? What would happen if you let go? What future are you really afraid of? They didn't answer at first. No one does when they're exposed. But eventually, one of them, a woman whose eyes looked carved from frost, stood up and said, "We were told Earth was weak because it felt too much. Now I see it strong because it never stopped. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. Even Ashfall spoke. Just once. A single sentence, in a voice that sounded tired enough to fall apart. We don't want revenge. We want the killing to stop. Not everyone clapped. Not everyone agreed. But that night when the stars flickered over Umoja and old wounds sat side by side with stubborn hope, something shifted. Even the war fleet noticed. 3 ships peeled off, quietly, gone without a trace. By morning, 5 more had left formation. The council didn't attack. They didn't retreat. They just waited, because empires never die in one explosion. They starve. They watch their prey grow teeth. They see kindness become something with armor. And then they fade. We weren't there yet. But we were close. The last thing that happened at the summit was unexpected. The child with the story cube stepped into the circle and played a recording. It was a lullaby. Not human. Not alien. Something in between. It had been created by refugees on Earth, blending harmonics from 8 species. And when it played, every translator device in the area turned off. Because it didn't need translation. It just was. Everyone sat still. Not because of fear, not because of politics, but because for one moment, every person in that circle remembered what it meant to simply exist together. Not perfectly, but peacefully. That night, someone scratched a message into the metal railing outside Umoja's western gate. No name, no title, just a sentence. We didn't survive to become monsters. We survived to end them. And maybe, just maybe, we were finally beginning to understand what winning meant. Not domination, not destruction, but removal of fear, of control, of the need to own. We weren't there yet, but we were becoming. We were Earthborn. In the years that followed the Umoja summit, we didn't celebrate, not the way old empires did. There were no parades, no flags planted on conquered soil, no holograms of dead leaders with victory speeches echoing through artificial skies. There was just quiet work, healing, fixing what was broken, and planting things where nothing had ever grown before. That's how it ended. Not with a single battle, not with one final weapon, but with a slow, stubborn refusal to let hate live any longer. The council didn't collapse all at once. It rotted, from the inside. More member systems broke away. Their own citizens refused to obey orders. Some council officers refused to follow bombardment commands. A few of the most powerful council families, the ones who had funded the initial refugee purge, fled to unclaimed sectors. They were never found. No one hunted them. We weren't in the business of revenge. Not anymore. By then, Earth had helped resettle nearly 22 million beings across the stars. Refugees, orphans, defectors, council survivors, and even a few species long thought extinct. Some chose to live among us. Others took what they needed and started new worlds under their own stars, with Earth's promise in their hearts. The Earthborn Accord grew from a whisper to a web. Planets once ruled by bloodshed now had Earthborn schools, where children of 8 different species learned side by side. Fleet engineers didn't carry rank anymore. They carried badges shaped like open palms. Even food changed. A single market on a space station near Vega once boasted 600 unique dishes, all fused from dozens of worlds. And through it all, Earth stood. We never became an empire. We never chased territory. Instead, we built. We built shelters on moons scarred by war. We rebuilt songs erased by silence bombs. We built languages that combined color, scent, touch, and sound. We built peace, not because we were soft, but because we knew the cost of war down to the last scream. And yet, we never forgot how this all started. 6 million. That number haunted us. It showed up in murals, in poems, in stories passed down by children whose parents had no graves. It lived in our memory, not to hurt us, but to shape us, to remind us that no matter how far we reached, we came from pain. And pain, when carried with grace, becomes strength. One of the last council outposts to be dismantled voluntarily was a communications array orbiting a collapsed star. Its commander, a man whose species had ruled over labor colonies for generations, sent a message before surrendering. Not to apologize, not to ask for mercy, but to confess. "We were wrong," he said, voice crackling through dust and distance. "We thought Earth would crumble under the weight of compassion. Instead, you taught the stars how to carry one another." That message was archived in the library of Umoja, which by then had become the largest interspecies knowledge center in recorded history. The walls were alive, covered in mosses from alien forests that changed color when someone read out loud. The floors hummed in soft frequencies to soothe the anxious. The ceiling showed stars, always real-time, always shifting. Every child who walked through that place learned the story, not just of Earth, but of what came after. One such child was named Leah. She had no known origin, found drifting in a frozen escape pod, wrapped in blankets that weren't hers. Her skin shimmered like dust under moonlight. Her voice came out like wind through cracked glass. No species claimed her. No record matched. But she was Earthborn, raised by two fathers, one human, one ferreti, in a refugee dome in South America. She grew up climbing trees that had never existed before the Alliance. She spoke 5 languages by age 7. She invented a 6th. And at 12, she asked a question that rippled across the Accord. Why do we still call them refugees, if they're home now? The council was long gone by then, but its shadow remained, and Leah, in her small, wide-eyed way, started a new wave of reform. She didn't mean to become a symbol, but sometimes the stars choose gently. By the time she turned 20, Leah was the youngest speaker ever elected to the Earthborn Accord Assembly. She refused to wear shoes at meetings. Always said, "The soil should remember who walks on it." Her first act, erasing the word refugee from all Earthborn documents. From that day forward, every being under the Accord would be called rooted, because they weren't floating anymore. They were home. Not just on Earth, not just on any one planet, but within each other. The final monument ever built on Earth itself was simple. No statues, no names, just a circle of stones, 6 million, each the size of a hand, each brought by someone, somewhere. People traveled from every corner of the galaxy to lay one down. Some cried, some sang. Most just knelt, touched the stones and whispered, "I remember." And that was enough. There were still problems, of course, fights over water on arid moons, disagreements about colony borders, accidental offenses between species with very different understandings of touch or noise or silence. Even the Earthborn stumbled. But we stumbled forward, together, because the foundation was no longer power. It was care, and care, unlike control, cannot be toppled by force. Years later, a new generation would ask, wide-eyed, innocent, did they really dump 6 million people on Earth just to punish it? And the old ones would nod, gentle and tired. Yes, they thought it would break us. Then the children would ask, but it didn't? And the answer would always be the same. No, they'd say, we didn't break, we bloomed. And they'd go on walking, hand in hand, into a future that didn't belong to any one species, any one flag, any one story, but to all of them, together. Earth never became the center of the galaxy. It didn't need to. It became something more powerful, a place you could carry in your heart, wherever you went.